History remembers pirates through caricature-loud men with crude flags, drunken laughter echoing across wooden decks, blades stained with blood and rum. They are remembered as predators who lived fast, stole faster, and died swinging from a rope as crowds watched without pity. This is the version that survives in popular memory, simple, masculine, and conveniently small. But history is never that clean. Between the margins of official records and the silence of forgotten lives, there exist figures so disruptive that the systems around them struggle to even describe what they witnessed. These are the anomalies, the outliers, the people who should not have existed according to the rules of their time, yet did. And in doing so, they exposed how fragile those rules truly were. One of those figures was a woman, and she did not simply sail the seas, she ruled them. Her name was Zheng Yi Sao, not the most famous pirate, not the most romanticized, but the most powerful. At her height, her authority stretched across the South China Sea like an invisible empire. Coastal villages feared her name more than imperial edicts. Merchants calculated routes not by wind or season, but by whether her flag had been sighted. Naval officers measured their careers not by victories, but by how long they could avoid crossing her path. Governments did not hunt her like a criminal. They negotiated with her like a sovereign. No pirate in recorded history, male or female, ever commanded power on this scale. And yet her story does not begin with fire or cannon smoke. It begins far from glory, far from legend, in a place designed to erase people rather than elevate them. She was born around 1775 in Canton during the reign of the Qing dynasty. A world governed by hierarchy, so rigid that one's fate was often sealed before the first breath was drawn. For women, especially poor women, life was a narrow corridor with walls closing in from every side. Obedience was virtue. Silence was safety. Ambition was a sin punished swiftly. Zheng Yi Sao's birth name has been lost to history. That alone tells us something. She did not come from a family worth recording, nor from a lineage that preserved its stories. She emerged from anonymity, and for much of her early life, anonymity was not just a condition, it was survival. As a young woman, she worked aboard a floating brothel known as a flower boat, anchored in the busy waters of Canton. These boats were not hidden on the fringes of society. They were woven directly into the economic and political bloodstream of the port city. Merchants, smugglers, officials, soldiers, men with power passed through them constantly. To outsiders, this world is easy to dismiss as degradation, and it was brutal. Women were bought, sold, discarded. Violence was common. Choice was rare. But it was also a place where information flowed freely. Drunken men speak, powerful men boast. Dangerous men reveal their fears without realizing it. Deals are whispered, bribes are arranged, rivalries surface, secrets leak. For someone observant, this floating underworld was not just a prison, it was a classroom. Zheng Yi Sao learned to listen. She learned how men performed strength while hiding weakness, how status changed the way people spoke, how fear could make even officials contradict themselves. She learned how authority was negotiated rather than assumed, and how those who believed themselves untouchable were often the most careless. These are not lessons taught in books. They are learned by watching closely and surviving quietly. In a society that denied women formal power, she studied informal power, the kind that truly moves events. She saw how money bent morality, how desperation reshaped loyalty, and how violence, when poorly managed, destroyed those who relied on it too heavily. She was not building an empire yet. She was learning how empires collapse. History rarely acknowledges this phase, preferring origins that feel heroic, decisive, dramatic. But real power almost always begins this observation in silence, in someone understanding the system long before they challenge it. By the time she encountered pirates, she already understood something fundamental. Chaos favors those who can impose order, and order favors those who understand human nature better than rules. Piracy in the South China Sea was not a romantic rebellion. It was an economic response to instability. The Qing dynasty struggled with corruption, population pressure, and uneven enforcement of law. Coastal communities were left vulnerable, trade routes poorly protected, and survival often meant choosing the lesser of two dangers. Pirates filled that vacuum. They were not outsiders attacking civilization. In many cases, they were the shadow infrastructure that kept it functioning. They taxed where governments could not. They enforced where officials were absent. They punished when courts were distant. This was the environment into which Zheng Yisao would eventually step, not as an idealist, not as a rebel, but as someone who already understood the mechanics of power from the lowest rung of society. When people later described her rise as sudden, they misunderstood its nature. Nothing about it was sudden. It was simply unseen. To those who met her in those early years, she appeared unremarkably another woman on a flower boat, another expendable life drifting between transactions. That invisibility was her greatest shield, because while others underestimated her, she was memorizing them. The South China Sea was a violent world governed by reputation. Strength mattered, but consistency mattered more. Leaders who ruled through random brutality rarely lasted. Their followers betrayed them. Their enemies waited patiently. Their own excess became their undoing. Zheng Yisao noticed this long before she ever held command. She noticed which men survived and which disappeared, which leaders inspired loyalty and which ruled through fear alone. She saw that discipline, not cruelty, was what kept dangerous men aligned toward a common goal. These observations would later define her rule. But at this stage, she was still gathering fragments, patterns, contradictions, truths that would one day form a complete system. History likes to imagine that power announces itself with confidence. In reality, it often begins as restraint. She restrained her reactions. She restrained her ambitions. She waited. And waiting in a world that constantly underestimated her was not weakness, it was strategy. When Zheng Yisao finally stepped onto the stage of history, observers would struggle to explain her authority. How could a woman command men who had lived their entire lives by violence? How could someone with no formal education impose laws where chaos once ruled? The answer lies herein, these forgotten years where she learned what most rulers never do. That power is not about appearing strong, but about understanding people deeply enough to predict them. Long before she issued commands, she studied compliance. Long before she punished disobedience, she studied betrayal. Long before she ruled fleets, she studied men who believed themselves untouchable and learned exactly how they fell. By the time history finally noticed her, it was already too late to stop what she had become, because empires do not rise when the world is watching. They rise quietly in places no one thinks to look, shaped by people no one believes matter until suddenly they control everything. By the turn of the 19th century, the South China Sea was no longer merely a stretch of water connecting ports and peoples. It had become a battleground of influence, desperation, and ambition. Trade was booming, but protection was weak. Imperial authority existed on paper, not on the waves. And wherever law retreats, power reorganizes itself in new forms. This was the world in which Zheng Yi sailed. Zheng Yi was already a name spoken. With caution, a seasoned pirate commander who led the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most formidable maritime forces operating along the Chinese coast. His ships were fast, his crews disciplined by pirate standards, and his reputation carefully cultivated. He was not a reckless raider. He was a strategist, a man who understood that survival at sea required alliances as much as violence. When Zheng Yi encountered Zheng Yi Sao around 1801, their union was not born of romance in the way later storytellers would imagine. It was transactional, calculated, and intelligent on both sides. For Zheng Yi, marrying her offered legitimacy within certain networks and access to intelligence channels that few pirate leaders fully appreciated. For her, the marriage was a doorway into a world she had already studied from the margins. She did not step aboard his fleet as a passive companion. She stepped aboard as an observer who already understood more than she revealed. Pirate marriages were rarely stable. They were political tools, temporary alliances, meant to secure loyalty or silence rivals. But, from the beginning, Zheng Yi Sao demanded something unusual: participation. She listened during meetings. She observed negotiations with merchants and smugglers. She watched how Zheng Yi balanced fear and reward among his captains. Many men underestimated her. Some ignored her entirely. That, again, was her advantage. She noticed patterns quickly. Which officers questioned orders indirectly, which captains skimmed from the loot, which alliances were built on convenience rather than loyalty. She saw how quickly unity fractured when profits declined, and how easily violence turned inward when leadership hesitated. Zheng Yi was a capable commander, but even he operated within the traditions of pirate culture: loose hierarchies, personal loyalty, and informal rules enforced unevenly. Zheng Yi Sao saw the limits of this system. She saw how fragile it was, how dependent it remained on a single man's authority, and she also saw opportunity. Over the next several years, the Red Flag Fleet expanded aggressively. Coastal raids increased. Protection payments grew. Rival pirate groups were either absorbed or destroyed. Ye's reputation rose, and with it, the attention of imperial authorities. The Qing Navy attempted sporadic crackdowns, but corruption and poor coordination undermined their efforts. Behind the scenes, Zheng Yi Sao became increasingly involved. She advised caution where Zheng Yi favored aggression. She encouraged alliances over annihilation. She pressed for standardized distribution of loot, understanding that resentment, not enemies, destroyed fleets from within. She was not reshaping the pirate world yet. She was testing it then. In 1807, nature intervened. a typhoon tore through the South China Sea, one of those sudden, merciless storms that erase ships as if they never existed. Zhang Yi's vessel was caught in it. By the time the storm passed, he was gunkling by the sea, without ceremony, without witnesses, without a body. News of his death spread quickly, and with it came instability. In pirate culture, death creates a vacuum. Leadership is not inherited, it is contested. Crews fracture, captains turn on one another, rivals sense weakness. This was the moment when the red flag fleet should have torn itself apart, and many expected it to. Zhang Yi Sao was now a widow in a world that rarely spared widows. She held no formal title, commanded no ship, and faced a fleet of men conditioned to follow strength, not legitimacy. Tradition dictated that she be sidelined, dismissed, or worse. She understood something crucial. Speed mattered more than force. Before rival captains could consolidate power, before alliances could shift, she acted. To first move was not violent. It was political. She aligned herself with Zhang Bo, Zhang Yi's adopted son, and one of the most capable commanders in the fleet. Zhang Bo was young, ambitious, and deeply respected by the crews. More importantly, he controlled ships and loyalty. Their alliance was immediate and deliberate. Later narratives would describe the relationship as romantic. That may have been true, but romance was secondary. What mattered was that together they represented continuity. Zhang Yi Sao brought legitimacy, intelligence, and institutional memory. Zhang Bo brought military authority and loyalty. Together, they neutralized opposition before it could form. She began meeting with captains individually, not issuing orders, but listening. She acknowledged grievances. She promised stability. She made it clear that chaos would benefit no one, and that those who threatened unity would face consequences. She did not posture. She did not threaten. She presented inevitability. For pirates accustomed to disorder after a leader's death, her calm was disarming. While others expected bloodshed, she offered structure. While others waited for weakness, she projected certainty. Some resisted. Those who did were dealt with quickly and decisively, not through open warfare, but through isolation. Ships were denied access to shared resources. Crews were persuaded to defect. Support vanished. Resistance collapsed without dramatic battles. Within weeks, the red flag fleet remained intact. Within months, it expanded. Zhang Yi Sao did not merely hold power. She transformed the conditions under which power operated. She understood that fear alone was unstable. Loyalty purchased through terror dissolved the moment authority wavered. So she built something stronger. She began formalizing rules. Yet, the full legal code she would later enforce, but the foundation of it, loot distribution, was standardized to prevent resentment. Chains of command were clarified. Punishments were no longer arbitrary, but predictable. Predictability creates trust even in violent systems. By making consequences consistent, she reduced internal conflict. By making rewards reliable, she encouraged discipline. Pirates, who once lived moment to moment, began thinking in terms of long-term survival. This shift was revolutionary. Piracy had always been reactive: strike, flee, repeat. Zhang Yi Sao envisioned something different: sustainability, a force that could endure pressure, adapt, and outlast opponents. She was not content to inherit an empire. She intended to surpass it. Rival pirate fleets watched these developments with unease. A woman consolidating power, this effectively disrupted expectations. Some mocked her. Others underestimated her. A few recognized the danger immediately. Those who challenged her directly found themselves facing a unified response rather than scattered resistance. Fleets that had once competed now coordinated. Intelligence flowed between ships. Ambushes were planned with precision. The red flag fleet was no longer just a pirate group. It was becoming an institution. Imperial officials noticed the change as well. Reports described an unusual level of discipline among pirate forces. Raids were no longer random. Patterns emerged. Coastal communities paid protection not to individual captains, but to a centralized authorities. Yi Sao's authority, she had achieved something extraordinary without a single public declaration of rule. No coronation, no proclamation. Power simply reorganized itself around her until opposition became impractical. This is how real dominance forms, not through spectacle, but through alignment. By the end of this phase of her rise, the question was no longer whether she could hold power. It was how far she intended to take it. And most had already missed the moment when she could have been stopped. Because by the time her enemies recognized what she had built, she had already transformed a pirate fleet into the nucleus of the largest maritime force the world had ever seen, one that did not rely on chaos, but commanded it. The widow had not vanished. She had become inevitable. Commanding pirates is not about titles. It never has been. At sea, parchment means nothing. Lineage means nothing. And promises dissolve the moment fear outweighs loyalty. Pirates follow only three things: certainty, reward, and consequence. Anyone who misunderstands this does not rule for long. Zheng Yi Sao understood it immediately when she consolidated control after Zheng Yi's death. She did not rush to declare herself supreme leader. Declarations invite challenges. Symbols provoke ego. Instead, she reshaped the environment so thoroughly that leadership became unavoidable. By the time anyone questioned her authority, the system already answered for her. Her first realization was brutal and precise. Chaos was wasting power. The South China Sea swarmed with pirates, but most were small, fragmented groups, violent, opportunistic, and short-lived. They fought one another as often as they fought the state. They stole, squandered, betrayed, and vanished. Their greatest enemy was not the navy, it was themselves. Zheng Yi Sao decided to end that. She began by unifying fleets that had once been bitter rivals. This was not achieved through endless bloodshed. Violence was expensive. It destroyed ships, crews, and reputations. She preferred absorption over annihilation. Those who joined her retained status, ships, and profit. Those who resisted were isolated, cut off from trade, supplies, and intelligence. Starved fleets surrender faster than defeated ones. Gradually, 6 major pirate divisions emerged under her command, each identified by a colored flag: red, black, blue, green, yellow, and white. These were not symbolic decorations. They represented functional command structures, each with defined responsibilities, territories, and chains of authority. At the center stood the Red Flag Fleet, her core force, her spine. For the first time in pirate history, a confederation existed that resembled a state rather than a swarm. Communication between fleets was standardized. Signals were coordinated. Intelligence was shared rather than hoarded. And above all, loyalty flowed upward, instead of sideways at its height. Her confederation commanded more than 1,800 ships and nearly 70,000 pirates. This number alone is staggering. To put it in perspective, many national navies of the era were smaller, slower, and less coordinated. What Zheng Yi commanded was not a criminal gang. It was a floating empire. But size alone does not create dominance. Order does. Pirate culture traditionally operated on informal rules understandings enforced unevenly. Punishments delivered inconsistently. Authority maintained through reputation rather than structure. This worked at small scales. At large scales, it produced rebellion. Zheng Yi abolished ambiguity. She introduced a formal legal code clear, uncompromising, and terrifying in its consistency. Every pirate under her command knew the rules. More importantly, they knew the consequences. Loot was registered immediately. Nothing could be hidden. Stolen treasure belonged to the collective before it belonged to the individual. Those who skimmed from the treasury were executed without exception, not punished, not imprisoned, executed. Orders were absolute. Disobedience during battle meant death. Desertion meant death. Theft from comrades meant death. But the law did not exist only to punish. It also protected. Violence against civilians was forbidden. Unauthorized killing brought execution. Rape was punishable by death. Captured women were not treated as spoils. They were either released, ransomed, or if both parties agreed, married with legal protections enforced by the fleet. This shocked her enemies and unsettled her followers. Pirates were accustomed to freedom defined by access. Zheng Yi redefined freedom as stability. Under her rule, pirates could expect something rare in their world: predictability. They knew what behavior would be rewarded. They knew what behavior would destroy them. Fear existed, but it was structured fear. And structured fear creates discipline. Discipline created trust. Trust created efficiency. Under her command, pirates stopped fighting one another. They stopped wasting energy on internal conflict. Their violence turned outward-focused, coordinated, and devastating. This transformation changed everything. Her fleets no longer struck randomly. They planned campaigns. They controlled shipping lanes systematically. Merchant vessels were intercepted with precision. Coastal villages were categorized: those under protection, those neutral, those resistant. Protection fees were standardized. Pay and you are left alone. Resisting, your harbor disappears. Entire communities complied not because they loved her, but because the rules were clear. Unlike imperial officials, she enforced her promises. This reliability made her more effective than the state itself. Imperial corruption meant taxes vanished into private pockets. Laws were applied unevenly. Protection depended on bribes. Zheng Yi offered something brutally simple: pay once, survive consistently. For many coastal communities, piracy under her rule was preferable to imperial neglect. The Qing dynasty understood this too late. When government forces encountered her fleets, they did not face chaos. They faced formations, coordinated maneuvers, decoy ships, ambushes, timed with tides and weather. Her captains were not improvising. They were executing plans. Captured sailors often defected rather than returned to imperial service. Life under Zheng Yi, while brutal, was fair by comparison. Food was shared. Spoils were distributed. Rules were enforced equally. Equality in punishment matters more than kindness. Even her officers were not exempt. Rank did not protect anyone from execution. This was critical. Pirates respected leaders who lived under the same blade as everyone else. Her authority became absolute, not because she demanded obedience, but because the system demanded it. Over time, something unprecedented happened. Zheng Yisao stopped reacting to imperial action and began shaping it. The Qing Navy found itself responding to her movements rather than directing its own. Fleets were redeployed defensively. Ports were abandoned. Trade rerouted. She dictated the rhythm of conflict. European powers observed cautiously. Portuguese ships clashed with her fleets and withdrew, shocked by their coordination. British commanders reported encountering pirate forces that behaved more like a navy than criminals. They hesitated. No one wanted to provoke a war they were not prepared to finish. Meanwhile, Zheng Yisao continued refining her internal order. She rewarded loyalty generously. Successful captains received increased authority, wealth, and security. Failure was punished swiftly, but never unpredictably. This balanced, generous reward, paired with absolute consequence, created something pirates had never known: long-term allegiance. Men who once lived only for the next raid now planned futures within her system. They married, they invested, they thought in terms of years instead of weeks. This was dangerous power, because when people believe a system can endure, they defend it. By the time her enemies grasped the scale of her transformation, the South China Sea was no longer a contested space. It was governed not by imperial decree, not by foreign cannons, but by a woman who understood that the greatest weapon at sea was not violence. It was order imposed on chaos. And once chaos is mastered, it does not matter who wears the crown, because everyone else is already obeying. Dominance, once established, reveals itself not through spectacle, but through absence, the absence of resistance, the absence of uncertainty, the absence of choice. By the time Zheng Yisao's system reached maturity, the South China Sea no longer behaved like a battlefield. It behaved like a controlled environment, one where movement, trade, and survival flowed through a single authority. Her fleets did not need to announce themselves. Their presence was already assumed. Fishing villages along the coast woke each morning, not wondering whether pirates would come, but whether they had already paid. Merchants calculated profits not by demand alone, but by the portion owed to the red flag. Entire ports measured safety by whether her protection seals were displayed openly on docks and warehouses. This was not fear born of chaos. It was fear born of reliability. When Zheng Yisao promised safety in exchange for compliance, she delivered. When she promised destruction for resistance, she delivered that. To smote in a world governed by broken promises and corrupt officials, this consistency was revolutionary. The Qing dynasty watched this transformation with alarm. Imperial reports described a strange phenomenon: piracy declining in some regions, increasing in others, but always in patterns. Ships vanished where protection was refused. Trade flowed uninterrupted where her authority was recognized. Villages, once devastated by random raids, now operated under predictable arrangements. From the imperial perspective, this was intolerable. The state could accept disorder. It could even tolerate corruption, but it could not tolerate a parallel authority. functioning more efficiently than itself. The first response was force. The Qing Navy mobilized squadrons to hunt her ships, confident that numbers and legitimacy would prevail. These fleets were composed of government sailors, poorly paid, often inexperienced, commanded by officers who purchased their positions through influence rather than merit. They sailed into waters Zheng Yi Sao had already mapped in detail. Her fleets did not meet them head-on. She understood asymmetry. Imperial ships were heavier, slower, predictable. They relied on formation and rigid command structures. Her ships were lighter, faster, and coordinated through signals refined over years. She allowed the Navy to advance. Then she surrounded them. Decoy vessels lured squadrons into narrow channels where maneuverability vanished. Hidden ships emerged from coves timed with tides. Communication lines were severed. Supplies were cut. Engagements occurred only when victory was assured. Some imperial ships were captured intact. Others were destroyed entirely. Survivors spread stories of confusion, panic, and commanders frozen by indecision. The Qing Navy retreated not in defeat, but in disbelief. This was not how pirates were supposed to fight. Subsequent campaigns fared no better. Each attempt drained resources, morale, and political capital. Officers blamed corruption. Corruption blamed logistics. Logistics blamed the sea itself. Meanwhile, Zheng Yi Sao adapted continuously. She studied naval responses, adjusted tactics, redeployed fleets, and avoided overextension. She never chased victory for its own sake. She chased sustainability. She did not need to destroy the Navy. She only needed to make it irrelevant. As imperial confidence weakened, her authority strengthened. More coastal communities aligned with her protection system. Merchants willingly paid her fees rather than gamble on state enforcement. Even some officials quietly cooperated, preferring predictable arrangements over futile resistance. The state was losing legitimacy. Foreign powers watched carefully. The Portuguese, long active in the region, encountered her fleets during patrols and skirmishes. They expected disorganized resistance. Instead, they faced disciplined formations and coordinated attacks. Losses mounted. Engagements became costly. The Portuguese withdrew. The British observed from a distance, calculating. Their reports describe pirate forces operating with unusual cohesion, capable of mass coordination across large distances. This was alarming. European naval doctrine depended on clear distinctions between state and criminal forces. Zheng Yi Sao erased that distinction. She commanded neither rebellion nor a rebellion's rhetoric. She claimed no ideology. She simply governed the sea. British commanders hesitated. Intervention risked escalation without clear benefit. Trade continued. Losses remained manageable. There was no justification for war, so they waited. This hesitation mattered because every moment without decisive opposition normalized her rule. Time is the silent ally of stable systems. As years passed, her control deepened. She imposed maritime taxes more efficiently than the empire. She enforced maritime law more consistently than the courts. She provided protection more reliably than the Navy. Her authority did not depend on recognition, it depended on function, and function always outlasts legitimacy. Internally, her fleets continued to operate with ruthless precision. Discipline did not weaken with success, it intensified. She knew complacency was the enemy of power. Officers were rotated, intelligence networks expanded. Alliances were monitored constantly for signs of decay. She rewarded competence relentlessly. She removed failure without hesitation, no sentiment, no nostalgia, no forgiveness for weakness. This cold clarity unnerved her enemies and steadied her followers. They did not need to love her. They needed to trust the system she enforced. By now, fear of her fleet surpassed fear of imperial punishment. This inversion marked a critical shift. When the state fears non-state actors more than they fear the state, authority has already changed hands. The Qing dynasty recognized this too late. Internal debates erupted. Some advocated escalation. Others urged negotiations. But escalation required resources the empire could not spare. Negotiation required admitting what everyone already knew, but could not say openly. They were not winning. Each failed campaign emboldened her. Each retreat weakened imperial resolve. Trade suffered. Revenues declined. Officials blamed one another. Zheng Yisao, meanwhile, remained patient. She did not press inland. She did not provoke unnecessary battles. She did not declare independence or issue proclamations. She let the empire exhaust itself trying to define her. This restraint was deliberate. She understood that states collapse not when attacked relentlessly, but when forced to confront their own inadequacy repeatedly. Eventually, imperial strategy shifted. Cannons were replaced with envoys. The same government that once branded her a criminal now considered negotiation. Amnesty was discussed, pardons proposed, conditions drafted and revised. This alone marked an unprecedented concession. Pirates were meant to be exterminated, not negotiated with. Yet, here was a woman whose power forced an empire to reconsider its assumptions. But before those negotiations could begin, her dominance had already reshaped the psychological landscape of the region. Sailors whispered her name with a mixture of fear and respect. Merchants told stories of protection honored and promises kept. Officials privately admitted that trade under her shadow was safer than trade under imperial neglect. She had become the standard by which authority was measured not through ideology, not through law, but through results. Her rule revealed an uncomfortable truth. People do not obey governments because they are legitimate. They obey them because they function. When legitimacy and function diverge, function wins. Zheng Yisao did not overthrow the empire. She outperformed it. And that is the most dangerous form of rebellion because it leaves the existing system standing, hollowed out from within, forced to negotiate not with a challenger, but with its own failure. By the time the Qing dynasty prepared to speak to her as an equal, the war for the sea was already over, not with a final battle, but with a silent acknowledgement she had won. By 1809, the South China Sea had reached a strange and unsettling equilibrium. Cannons still existed, fleets still sailed, but the rhythm of power had shifted so completely that the old rules no longer applied. The Qing dynasty had not been defeated in a single dramatic confrontation. It had been worn down slowly, methodically by a force it could neither destroy nor ignore. Zheng Yisao understood this moment better than anyone. Empires rarely collapse when they are attacked head-on. They collapse when they are forced to negotiate with what they once dismissed. When the state begins to bargain with those it labeled criminals. Authority is already fractured. Inside the imperial court, debate turned bitter. Some officials demanded renewed military campaigns, convinced that honor required one final, overwhelming show of force. Others, more pragmatic, more fearful, argued that continued resistance was bleeding the treasury, humiliating the navy, and destabilizing coastal trade beyond recovery. Reports from the provinces were grim. Merchants rerouted ships or refused to sail. Villages paid pirates instead of taxes. Naval officers requested transfers rather than face another campaign at sea. Desertion increased. Morale collapsed. The truth was unavoidable. The Qing dynasty could not defeat Zheng Yi Sao, and worse, everyone knew it. When the idea of amnesty was first raised, it was considered unthinkable. Amnesty was not a tool of victory. It was a confession of failure. Yet history shows that empires, like individuals, will compromise anything to preserve the illusion of control. Envoys were quietly dispatched. Terms were cautiously discussed. Language was softened. The word criminal disappeared from internal correspondence and was replaced with something far more revealing: leader. Zheng Yi Sao did not rush to respond. Silence is leverage. She knew that every passing day strengthened her position. Trade still flowed through her networks. Her fleets remained disciplined. Her authority remained intact. The empire, meanwhile, grew more desperate. When she finally agreed to negotiations, she did so not as a supplicant, but as a ruler managing a transition of power. She traveled to Canton, not in chains, not under guard, but openly accompanied by her followers, dressed with the confidence of someone who had already won. Observers expected defiance. What they witnessed instead was something far more unsettling: control. She listened more than she spoke. She allowed imperial officials to explain their terms, knowing they would begin with demands they could not enforce. She let them posture, threaten, retreat, and revise. Every adjustment revealed weakness. Then she spoke. Her conditions were not framed as requests. They were framed as requirements for peace. Full amnesty for herself, full amnesty for her followers, retention of personal wealth, and the right for her captains to integrate into the imperial system, or retire with honor. She would not beg. She would not bargain. She would define the terms of surrender for the empire. Officials recoiled. Then they calculated. The alternative was another campaign they could not win. Slowly, reluctantly, they conceded. The agreement was signed. Zheng Yi Sao and Zhang Bo received imperial pardons. Their fleets were disbanded. Thousands of pirates laid down arms, not under threat, but under guarantee. Some joined the Qing Navy. Others returned to civilian life. Zheng Yi Sao herself retired to Canton, where she operated a gambling house and lived quietly for decades, respected, untouched, and remembered. She had not been broken by the system. She had bent it to her will. Her legacy was not romanticized. It was erased not because she failed, but because she succeeded too completely. A woman who commanded 70,000 pirates, who forced an empire to its knees, who ruled the seas with discipline and loss. Such a figure had no place in the stories men told about power. So history reduced her to a footnote, a curiosity, a wife who inherited her husband's fleet. But those who lived through her reign never forgot. They remembered a woman who understood that true power does not shout, it listens. It does not break systems, it rebuilds them. It does not seek glory. It seeks control and holds it, not through fear alone, but through the terrible, beautiful clarity of order imposed on chaos. Zheng Yisao did not become a pirate queen by accident. She became one by design, forged in silence, sharpened by observation, and perfected through an understanding of human nature that no amount of education could teach. She was not an exception to the rules of her time. She was their refutation, and in the quiet spaces between official records, in the margins where history forgets to look, her empire remains, not as myth, but as fact. The most powerful pirate who ever lived was a woman who learned to rule by first learning to see. For her crew, she demanded full amnesty, the right to retain her personal wealth, official recognition for selected commanders, no retribution, no secret punishments, and, perhaps most astonishingly, she insisted that her pirates be permitted to reintegrate into society without stigma or shame. The imperial court hesitated, but hesitation held no weight. There were no alternatives remaining. What followed was unprecedented in Chinese history. Thousands of pirates-men who had terrorized the coastline for years received pardons. Many were absorbed directly into the imperial navy. Others returned peacefully to civilian existence. Zheng Yisao herself faced no punishment, no imprisonment, no public humiliation. She was permitted to walk away freely. The empire preserved the appearance of its authority. The pirates preserved their lives, and Zheng Yisao preserved her power by choosing precisely when to relinquish it. This decision revealed the final layer of her genius. Most rulers are destroyed not by their enemies, but by their inability to stop. Power becomes identity. Identity becomes obsession. Obsession clouds judgment. Leaders cling to dominance long after circumstances have turned decisively against them. Zheng Yisao did not. She understood something profoundly rare, that survival itself is a form of victory. By accepting amnesty, she did not admit defeat. She converted unstable power into permanent security. She transformed military dominance into social legitimacy. She escaped the fate that awaited every pirate who mistook momentum for immortality. History brims with conquerors who won battles only to lose themselves. She refused to join their ranks. After retiring from piracy, Zheng Yisao disappeared from the sea as completely as she had once dominated it. She opened a gambling house, later managing a prosperous and legitimate business enterprise. She lived openly, legally, without fear of pursuit or revenge. No bounty hunters appeared, no secret arrests followed, no imperial trap was ever sprung. The empire honored its word. That fact alone speaks volumes about the true nature of her former power. She lived into old age, an outcome almost unheard of among pirates. She died around 1844, not by execution, not by betrayal, not in some dramatic last stand designed to immortalize her legend. She died quietly, and that quiet ending may be the most radical element of her entire story, because it contradicts everything history teaches us about dominance. We are conditioned to believe that power must end violently, that rulers must fall, that legends require tragedy. Zheng Yisao dismantled that narrative by refusing to perform it. She did not need martyrdom. She did not need myth. She needed control over her own fate. Historians often struggle with her legacy because it undermines comforting narratives. We prefer stories where rebellion is crushed, where order triumphs visibly, where moral lines remain clear. Zheng Yisao blurred every boundary. She was a criminal who governed more effectively than the state. She was a woman who commanded men through discipline, not seduction. She was a pirate who created law. She was a ruler who knew when to abdicate. Even her name reflects this tension. History remembers her not by her own chosen identity, but as Zheng Yi, South the wife of Zheng Yi. Her personal name remains unknown. This erasure is not accidental. It is a final attempt by history to reduce her to something comprehensible within a male-centered narrative. And yet, despite this reduction, her achievements remain undeniable. She commanded the largest pirate fleet ever recorded. She forced one of the world's great empires to negotiate. She retired with wealth, safety, and dignity. No amount of minimization can erase those facts. What makes her story endure is not merely what she did, but how she did it. She did not rely on charisma alone. She did not rule through random terror. She did not mistake cruelty for strength. She understood that fear without structure breeds rebellion, while structure even, when harsh, creates stability. She also understood something even rarer, that power is temporary by nature, and those who pretend otherwise are eventually consumed by it. In this sense, Zheng Yisao was not merely a pirate, she was a philosopher of power. She recognized that dominance is a phase, not an identity, that control is a tool, not a destiny, that survival sometimes requires stepping away rather than pushing forward. Most conquerors fail this test. They expand until resistance hardens. They rule until loyalty rots. They fight until victory becomes impossible to distinguish from ruin. Zheng Yisao did none of these things. She observed the shifting balance, recognized the moment of maximum leverage, and chose exit over extinction. This decision requires a form of courage history rarely celebrates, the courage to let go. Because letting go means abandoning certainty. It means relinquishing control before it is taken. It means trusting that one's worth is not defined solely by dominance. For someone who rose from absolute vulnerability to absolute authority, this was the ultimate assertion of agency. She controlled not only others, but herself. In the end, her life forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What if the greatest victory is not conquest, but autonomy? Zheng Yisao did not seek immortality through legend. She sought continuity through survival. And in doing so, she exposed the fragility of the systems that opposed her. Empires outlast individuals, but they rarely learn from them. The Qing dynasty survived her, but it did not defeat her. It merely outlived the moment when she chose to matter. That distinction echoes across history. Power does not always end in collapse. Sometimes it ends because the person holding it decides they no longer need it. And that choice is more threatening to established order than any rebellion, because it suggests that authority is not sacred, that hierarchy is negotiable, that the rules can be rewritten and then discarded. Zheng Yisao's story does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. It asks us to reconsider what strength looks like when stripped of spectacle, what leadership looks like without mythology, what success looks like when measured not by how loudly one falls, but by how quietly one leaves. History prefers heroes who die dramatically. They are easier to control, easier to categorize, easier to moralize. Zheng Yi Sao denied history that comfort, she lived. And by living, she became something far more dangerous than a legend. She became proof that power is not reserved for the anointed, proof that systems can be bent by those who understand them, proof that survival is not cowardice but mastery. She did not conquer the world. She mastered her place within it, and then, when the sea no longer served her purpose, she walked away unbroken, unrepentant, undefeated. That is why she remains unmatched. Not because she ruled the waves, but because she knew exactly when to leave them behind. Zheng Yi Sao's story does not end simply with her withdrawal from the sea, nor with her survival, nor with her quiet retirement in Canton. To truly understand her significance, we must examine the consequences of her life, the echoes she left behind in history, in strategy, and in the understanding of human behavior. For centuries, history has been obsessed with extremes. We celebrate those who die violently. We immortalize those whose power is uncontested and whose fall is dramatic. But in doing so, we overlook a much rarer, subtler, and perhaps more difficult form of mastery, the mastery of timing, of restraint, and of self-determination. Zheng Yi Sao exemplifies this rare mastery. She demonstrates that true power is not merely the ability to dominate others, but the ability to navigate, predict, and manipulate the currents of circumstance to one's own advantage and ultimately, to know when to step away. From the moment she ascended to leadership of the Red Flag Fleet after Zheng Yi's death, she redefined what it meant to wield power. Most narratives of leadership focus on visible conquests, the battles won, the enemies crushed, the territory claimed. But Zheng Yi Sao's genius was largely invisible. She built loyalty without relying on coercion alone. She created an empire without official titles. She imposed order on chaos, not through the brute force that so often defines pirate lore, but through a combination of discipline, strategic alliances, legal structures, and psychological insight. Every action she took was calculated to stabilize her authority while minimizing unnecessary conflict. She understood the human psyche as profoundly as any general understood strategy, knowing that men respond predictably to fairness, fear, reward, and the clear imposition of rules. Her fleet was not merely a collection of ships. It was a living, functioning institutia protestate, organized to survive, expand, and resist external threats, not as a mob, but as a disciplined force operating under her command. Her approach was deeply modern in a way few historians have acknowledged. In contemporary terms, we might describe her as a systems thinker, a strategist who understood emergent properties. She created feedback loops that reinforced loyalty, punished disobedience predictably, and stabilized power across thousands of individuals. She regulated her operations so that even mistakes were manageable. By codifying rules for behavior both for pirates and for civilians within her sphere, she turned unpredictability into a resource rather than a liability. Every pirate who followed her knew the consequences of action. Every village understood the terms of survival under her protection, and in doing so, she made chaos manageable not just for herself, but for everyone operating within her system. That is a lesson of staggering significance, because it suggests that leadership is not a matter of personality or intimidation alone, but of creating systems in which desired behaviors naturally emerge while undesired behaviors are systematically disincentivized. Zheng Yisao's legal code, her fleet organization, and her system of rewards and punishments were not inventions for historical acclaim. They were necessities. The South China Sea was an environment of extreme instability, crowded with rival pirate groups, undermined by a corrupt state, and frequently disrupted by natural disasters. Leaders who relied solely on charisma or intimidation found themselves betrayed, overthrown, or destroyed. But she recognized that survival depended not on fear alone, but on predictability. She created trust without sentiment, loyalty without flattery, and order without tyranny. That is what made her unmatched. The men who followed her were not simply afraid of her. They respected the system she created. They depended on it. They calculated their futures within its boundaries. That is how she maintained control over tens of thousands of pirates across hundreds of ships, a feat unparalleled in maritime history. Beyond the immediate tactical and strategic mastery, Zheng Yisao's story forces us to reconsider the intersection of gender and power. In a world that systematically excluded women from leadership, she not only succeeded, but dominated in an environment constructed to marginalize her. The fact that she was able to command male pirates, some of whom were seasoned, violent, and accustomed to following only men, reveals a profound understanding of authority as separate from gender. She did not rely on the social narratives that typically empowered men. She relied on competence, clarity, and consistency. Her gender was, in some sense, irrelevant to her effectiveness, yet it amplified the shock and awe of her contemporaries. Officials, rivals, and even European observers were forced to confront a reality that destabilized assumptions. A woman could not only participate in the structures of power, but redefine them entirely. This disruption of social expectation magnified her psychological influence. It introduced uncertainty into the minds of her enemies, while simultaneously consolidating her internal authority, because she proved that obedience was a rational response to competence, not to tradition. Zheng Yisao's approach to negotiation demonstrates an equally sophisticated understanding of leverage and timing. Her amnesty in 1809 was not an act of weakness, but the culmination of years of calculated strategy. Most pirate leaders cling to power until it destroys them. Most conquerors pursue expansion long past the point of strategic advantage. She did the opposite. She recognized that her greatest victories would not come from perpetual dominance, but from converting temporary advantage into permanent security. She negotiated from a position of strength, yet she did so with subtlety, offering compliance and integration into the state, not because she feared it, but because it was the most rational and enduring choice available. This is a masterclass in strategic thinking, the awareness that sometimes the greatest power lies in choosing not to act, in stepping away from confrontation while retaining all the benefits of success. Her surrender, or rather, her transition, forced an empire to recognize her authority without combat. She maintained wealth, protection, and dignity. She preserved the lives of her followers. She ensured that her influence would continue, albeit indirectly, within the structures of the state. That is the kind of foresight few leaders in any age achieve. Her retirement and subsequent quiet life further underscore the depth of her mastery. She could have clung to the sea, attempting to maintain relevance until age or chance destroyed her. She could have pursued greater fame, seeking immortality through legend or infamy. Instead, she opted for autonomy, self-determination, and longevity. By walking away from the waters she had once dominated, she illustrated the ultimate form of control, the ability to decide the terms of one's own narrative. Most historical figures are subject to the narratives others construct about them. Zheng Ye Sao was not. She concluded her life on her own terms, demonstrating that survival, freedom, and dignity can be greater achievements than conquest itself. This choice also reflects an understanding of the temporality of power, of knowing when influence has peaked, when expansion is unnecessary, and when continuation would risk annihilation. Many leaders failed to recognize this, and history punishes them for it. She recognized it, and history has struggled ever since to categorize her. Her story also invites reflection on the nature of systems and institutions. The fleets she commanded, the laws she enforced, and the structures she implemented were all evidence that even criminal networks can operate with efficiency, predictability, and sustainability. In some ways, her pirate confederation anticipated modern organizational theory, hierarchy tempered by accountability, incentives balanced against consequences, and authority legitimized by function rather than tradition. She demonstrated that success is not only about brute force, but about the ability to design environments in which desired outcomes emerge naturally. This is a lesson that transcends the context of piracy. It applies to governance, business, military strategy, and social dynamics. Her genius lies not only in her victories, but in the intelligence with which she structured those victories to endure beyond immediate conflict. Even today, the psychological lessons of her life remain profound. She mastered perception. She manipulated expectations. She understood that reputation, consistency, and calculated visibility can be as powerful as fleets and cannons. By controlling how others perceived her, she guided behavior. Rivals hesitated. Allies remained loyal. Empires were compelled to negotiate. She controlled not only actions, but beliefs, not only events, but interpretation. This is subtle power at its purest. It is the kind of influence that persists even when physical dominance wanes, and it is precisely what allowed her to retire safely, wealthy, and respected. Zheng Yi Sao also teaches a lesson in adaptability. The maritime environment she navigated was inherently volatile. Typhoons, shifting alliances, changing imperial policies, and the unpredictability of human behavior made her position inherently unstable. Yet she adapted constantly. She observed, learned, and restructured, luring her organization to survive shocks that would have destroyed less agile leaders. Adaptability was not improvisation. It was strategic recalibration. She anticipated threats, managed them proactively, and converted them into opportunities. In this way, she demonstrates that true mastery requires not only intelligence and strength, but also humility, understanding that conditions change and that rigidity invites disaster. Her life also reframes how history measures greatness. Most historical metrics celebrate conquest, wealth, or notoriety. Zheng Yi Sao challenges those conventions. She achieved wealth, but did not squander it. She exercised power, but did not abuse it beyond strategic necessity. She survived not through luck, but through calculation and foresight. And she retired not in defeat, but in victory. The combination of operational genius, psychological insight, strategic patience, and self-restraint makes her not merely a historical curiosity, but an exemplar of multidimensional leadership. Her greatness is measured not by the scale of destruction she caused, but by the scope of stability she enforced, the lives she preserved, and the intelligence she exercised in every decision. Finally, Zheng Yisao's legacy is about perspective. History often romanticizes pirates as rebels and outlaws, emphasizing spectacle, violence, and defiance. Zheng Yisao complicates that narrative. She was a pirate, but she was also a leader, a strategist, a system builder, and a negotiator. She was an innovator, operating outside conventional structures, yet she ultimately engaged with those structures when it served her purposes. Her life demonstrates that labels criminal, pirate, woman, widow are inadequate to capture the totality of human capability. She cannot be neatly categorized. She exists as a reminder that power, mastery, and intelligence often operate in the shadows of conventional understanding, and that true leadership often defies expectation, tradition, and stereotypes simultaneously. Her story, when considered in full, becomes more than the tale of a pirate queen. It becomes a study in human potential, in the psychology of control, in the art of timing, and in the mastery of circumstances. It challenges us to consider how authority is constructed, how systems function, and how individuals navigate environments designed to suppress them. It forces us to reconsider what survival, success, and legacy truly mean, and it demonstrates that the most formidable form of power is not domination alone, but the capacity to bend events, people, and systems toward one's own ends, while preserving autonomy and life itself. Zheng Yisao did not merely command a fleet. She commanded circumstances. She commanded perception. She commanded the flow of history around her without ever forcing its hand. And when she chose to step away, she demonstrated that ultimate mastery is the ability to leave the game entirely intact, undefeated, and unbound. In the end, she leaves us with an enduring question: what is the measure of greatness? Is it in conquest, in destruction, or in survival? Is it in the applause of history, or in the quiet knowledge that one has achieved mastery over life itself? Zheng Yisao's answer is clear. True power is exercised with foresight, intelligence, and restraint. It is measured not by the battles fought, but by the life preserved, the system stabilized, and the legacy secured, not through spectacle, but through quiet, decisive action. Her life is a testament to the power of strategy over force of intellect, over impulse, of patience over hubris, and of timing over brute effort. It is a reminder that the rarest victories are often invisible, that the most profound lessons lie not in legend, but in the careful orchestration of reality. Zheng Yisao's story endures because it transcends simple categories. It is history as strategy, psychology, and philosophy woven together in the life of a woman who ruled the waves, commanded respect from emperors, and walked away alive, undefeated and unbound. It is a story that will never fully belong to those who tell it, because its genius lies precisely in its defiance of expectation, its subtlety, and its quiet mastery.